and Society at the University of Cape Town and the NRF Saatchi Chair in Security and Justice. The recording was part of a series of seminars entitled #Thought Leader Encounter, featuring leading and emerging academics on law and society in Africa. If you would like to find out more about the work of the Center, please check out our website at www.cls.uct.ac.za or follow us on Facebook at CLSUCT or Twitter at CLSUCT. Happy listening.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our lunchtime session, which is co-hosted with CLS. Today we have Tyra, who will be speaking to us on rethinking property in South Africa. Tyra is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. She's worked at LARC before for a long time, so she may be a familiar face to a lot of us. And fun fact, she actually is a magician. So, so stay tuned. You never know a coin will come out of your ear. Check into your sandwiches, you will find ribbons inside.
Pots of money. Can we find pots of money in our sandwich?
But I'm sure this is going to be a very engaging session with a very engaging topic. So that's all. Welcome, Tyra. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Well, lucky I brought magic with me after that introduction. So I'm actually going to begin with some magic in order to begin thinking about the issue of property. So I want you to imagine that what I'm holding here in my hand is the way that often I think in law school we begin to think about property. I haven't actually been to law school myself, but this is what I've been told. So you think of property as a thing, right? Here's this thing that I'm holding in my hand. Now I'm going to take this thing and put it in my hand and watch as it vanishes and reappears in my pocket. So the thing is not quite the thing that we thought it was initially. Now, what happens if I take this thing and put it in my left hand? Which hand is it in?
Left.
What do you think? Left, yes, but also the right. So what we think is just this thing called property can actually subdivide and multiply into a bunch of other things. Now, if I put them down here on the table, can you see them? Mm-hmm. Everyone see them? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is try and make these pieces of property change places. So if I take one, put it in this hand, take the other, put it in that hand, and watch. They've changed places to you. Do you see them change hands? No? Okay, let's try that again. So take one, put it in my left hand, one in the right, and watch as they change places. Mm-hmm. Now, if I take this element of property, so we're going to call it an element now rather than a thing, and I put it in my hand, right? So it's in my left hand. Could I have a volunteer, please, to hold this in their hand? Anyone? Okay. Can you please, I think you may need to come around. Come to the front. Everyone can see you that way too. Give a round of applause for. Okay, can you hold out your hand, please? And close it up tight and turn it this way. So now what I'm going to try and do is make the property change hands from my hand to yours. Are you ready?
Yes.
1, 2, 3. Open your hand. Thank you, person. Now, the other thing about property is that we often think about it as something physical. You can touch it, you can feel it, you can walk on it, and so on. But property is actually a lot more complicated than that. If I take this one and put it in my hand, and now I'm going to put it in my pocket. And can you just actually feel that it is in my pocket, just that I'm not lying, right? Now, property also has these conceptual and ethereal qualities. So if you watch this dark spot on my pants, if I just begin to rub like that, you'll see that it begins to actually like transition through the solid material, like that. Now, I've got these two elements of property. Could I have another volunteer, please?
I would love to do it.
Okay, good. Come on up. Give a round of applause. So there are many elements to property, but for now we're dealing with just the two. So could you open your hand, please? Put those two in, close it tight, and hold it that way. Make sure they don't jump out. Now the trick is that there's actually a third element here that we're going to deal with. If I take this one, put it in my hand, I'm going to try and make it jump from my hand to yours. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Open up.
Amazing.
Thank you. Thanks. So now we've got these three elements of property. Now, I'm assuming you guys can count to 3. Would that be right? Okay, great. So I'm going to ask for your participation then in counting to 3. Okay? So I'm going to put 1 in my hand. So count with me. 1, 2, and 3 in my pocket. So how many are in my hand? 2. Actually, there are 3. 1, 2, 3. Guys, you said you could count. Let's try this again. Okay, so 1, 2, 3 in my pocket. So how many are in my hand? 2. There are once again 3. Okay, last time to get this right. Come on. So 1 into the hand. You can see it in there. 2 is going into my hand, and 3 into my pocket. How many are in my hand?
3.
How many elements of property? 2. We've actually just got like one big bundle of right. And I'll pass it around so you can check there's no funny business. Okay, so now I want you to imagine that if we closed our eyes for a minute, and when you opened them, someone had stolen your phones, all your phones.
I don't think I like them.
Or magic them away. What would be your first thought? What is it that you would miss most about your phone? Okay, let's hear. So raise your hand so I can see. Yeah.
Photos of my children.
Photos of your children, okay.
Cannot get backed up.
Okay.
All the contacts that I have in there, like numbers.
Okay, yeah.
Photos of my grandmother was passed away.
Any others?
Being able to call and text people.
Yes.
A whole day.
Yes.
Some, I'm going to be thinking, but in a way, it's all on the cloud, right? So actually, I could get a new phone. So it's not. I mean, it's
Okay, it's not the end of the world for you.
it's not-
Okay, sure.
Well, I couldn't get a new phone, so it's off social media for like 2 months.
I think for me, I don't have insurance. So
Okay, yeah. Any others? Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed is a kind of common denominator in a lot of the answers is that you would miss the ability to contact people, to look at photos of people that you love, to have your contacts, your social networks, to get on Facebook, to get in touch with people. So on the one hand, as many of you have pointed out, a phone it costs a lot of money. So it's something that we have to insure, or something that we might lose, something that would be costly to replace. It's a thing that we would have to buy again. But more than that, it also carries with it a set of social connections, which we can exercise through it. In that sense, I think a cell phone is quite a useful way to think about how property is more than just a thing, more than just a monetary item. It is also something that holds within it and through which you can communicate with people, something that indicates the different social connections that you have. So as we move through the seminar today, sort of want you to keep that in mind. You can keep your phones in front of you if you like, or put them away, but keep in mind that this is a useful way to think about what property is. Whenever you're dealing with some other form of property, think of it in terms of, okay, how would this relate to something like my phone, which is also a thing, a piece of property that I bought, that I consider mine, that I would feel that I would be wronged if it was taken. But at the same time, it's a way that people contact you. It's something social. So the next thing that I wanted us to all think about, And perhaps if you can turn to the person next to you in talking through these questions is, so I'd like to know from you, based on general knowledge or your own previous experiences in your studies, whether it's law or something else, how would you define property? So perhaps you've been taught that it should be defined in a particular way. Maybe in an exam you were told, give us a definition of property. And what would you put down? And what about property law? How would you define that? So just take a few minutes to turn to the person next to you and talk about how you would answer these two questions based on your previous studies or general knowledge. So let's come together and hear about what it is you've learnt about property or what general knowledge about it you picked up, what you spoke about with the people in your group. So anyone want to share what you talked about? What is property?
One thing that was interesting to us is that it wasn't necessarily ownership over things that
Okay.
defined it as property. It was just something that was there. It's a thing.
Okay. So by that do you mean like something physical when you said something that was there, or?
I mean, we all know that it doesn't have to be right in front of us.
Okay.
An asset.
An asset? Okay.
You need to be able to control it in a way, or have a certain control over the thing.
Okay.
The wide range of property, like is saying, like you need to have a claim on, we then say applicable on land, on sea, and then in the air, right? In
Okay.
terms of the space we can fly over what jurisdiction.
Okay, great.
And also, to say that the public and private property, because there are also some things that are not owned by anyone, like would be firefight or something. So it's quite expansive. And in terms of the things that are tangible that you can touch and point at, or things that are intangible, particularly now because they are like intellectual property and,
Sure.
and that,
Yep.
and even to the extent that it's not just applicable to people near you, it can be enforced in other jurisdictions, like things like intellectual property.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got a lot there. So I've written up some of these. You mentioned private and public property, some things that can't be owned, like somewhere way out in the ocean, intellectual property, things that are tangible and intangible. You mentioned land, mining, so underground, sea, air. And these are all very, sea and air in particular, interesting and often not discussed areas of property ownership. Yeah, other things. People, okay. So were you thinking directly in the sense of slavery, owning people? Absolutely. And there might also be other kinds of ownership, like debt bondage, something. Yeah.
Set of relationships to a thing.
Mm-hmm. And are you thinking a set of relationships that one person has to a thing, or that several people have with each other to a thing?
It can be one or several.
Okay. So a set of relationships of a person to a thing, or several people to each other with regards to a thing. Yeah, really important point. Yeah.
To the point that said some things that can't be owned.
Right.
I think property is having almost a potential to be owned.
Okay. Okay, very interesting.
So yeah, just building on what my colleague said earlier, just said we spoke about private property in traditional Roman law sense, having real rights or something, as we were taught back in the day. But then also public property, and then so just in terms of categorization, and then property that is not in the public domain, so the sort of more grey areas like estates and things like that, in certain respects of deep seas. And then something that came up also is, which has been touched on already, ownership in the context of cyberspace. You know, things of cryptocurrency now, how this has kind of changed how we understand ownership, value, assets, etc.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, Yasha.
So property is about exclusion.
Mm.
What sort of delineates who has power in a certain and who doesn't?
Okay, so you're kind of thinking with exclusion comes power. So kind of drawing the boundaries around what one owns, and in the process of doing that, deciding who must be excluded from ownership. Yeah. Yeah, other things that you talked about?
The right to use, destroy the thing, or draw fruits from it. Profit from it, yeah.
And this idea that you mentioned, is the idea that once you take ownership of something, you are able to exercise those rights over it?
Yes. So ownership is described as having those rights, and then there are different types of ownership that sometimes have the use element, but you don't have the right to destroy, and there are different combinations of those rights that one can have.
Okay, interesting. So we've got a lot going on here. A lot of really interesting ideas that you guys have thrown out. So complicating that initial idea that I began with in the magic of property as a thing, and saying, well, it's a set of relationships that people have with each other over a thing, or a set of relationships with a thing. Then the whole thingness of property becomes impossible to consider it as just a thing when you begin to think of dealing with rights or claims over spaces that are not easily visible or material spaces, like sea or air, or underground mining rights, for example. The idea that anything has the potential to be enclosed, to be made property, to be owned. And then, also very important, the notion of power, which is something we're going to talk about quite a lot in the seminar, of what happens when you're given ownership over something, when you obtain ownership over something. What power are you able to exercise over other people, and not only over the space that you own. And the process of exclusion that goes with it. And I would like to add there also inclusion. So in every process of exclusion, it's often a process of people also defining who they are, who has the right to access something, who are the owners. So certain people's rights get included and others are excluded from that process of drawing a boundary around something. And then what about property law? So we've spoken about property in quite a conceptual way. Does property law, as you've learnt it, as you know it, does it fit all these different complex aspects that we've talked about with regard to property? Yeah.
Well, it's very broad.
Okay.
I would say that it's the law governing the relationship between legal subjects and legal objects. I use the term legal object because it includes what is not restricted to a thing.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so can you say that again? So property law, as you see it, is
the law governing the relationship between legal subjects and legal objects.
Okay. And how would you define a legal subject?
Typically a person, natural or juristic. So it can be a living person or a company.
Okay, great. Other things that you think property law does, how would you define it in relation to what we've discussed before? Yeah.
I define it as a value system.
Okay,
good. It's a system that gives value to your thing based on a set of values that it itself seeks to replicate, protect, validate. Yeah.
So that's a really interesting point, because the implication then is that property law is not a neutral system. It's one that carries with it a particular history, particular values, particular traces of ideas. Yeah. Other thoughts?
So having learnt property law here, what comes to mind for me is Roman Dutch law.
Okay.
And just how we learn about property law and where that knowledge is coming from.
Okay, so particular history from Roman Dutch law, sort of Roman Dutch law property, yeah.
I'll say it's the law that defines property and how it is used, all the things for
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So it kind of regulates these qualities that you mentioned that you might get through ownership. Yeah.
So property is about inclusions and exclusions.
Yes.
outlook at property law is about limitations.
Okay, say a bit more about that. Limitations.
So then it says you can exclude, but within these parameters, you can include within these parameters.
Okay, great. So kind of, yeah, limitations or qualifications for inclusion or exclusion. Yeah, Ninka.
So our group said that property law fulfills an ideological function in reinforcing unequal power relations that are affected by property, the role of property as a whole.
Okay, yeah, so really important point, and similar to the one Nolundi also made about it holds within a particular value system. Yeah.
I think attached to the value system and placed on the property is who can own property in the sense of can an individual own property or can a group of people own property collectively.
And how does South African property law sort of deal with that question? So that's something that we'll discuss in the seminar. So this is a really important point too. So individual versus a group. I'm just going to write up here. So this other point that Aninka made, that inequality is part of how property tends to operate here. Okay. Anything else you want to add to that? So one of the points that I wanted to make, and I think you guys have got it very well, is that if we look at what we've written up here, all the complexities of property, it becomes clear that it's difficult to develop a legal system, often in the way that we're taught either through general knowledge or through studies, the notion of a regulatory system that can live up to the reality of how people actually live their lives, of how people deal with the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, and in particular of how to deal, especially in the South African context where we have a commitment to redressing inequality that we've inherited from the past. How does our property system either succeed or fail in redressing the inequalities that are embedded in the law of property that currently exists here? So one of the things that I had asked you to read is an article by Carol Rose, who's a legal scholar and anthropologist. What Rose argues is that together with this sort of value system that we have inherited from the past, that's embedded within our property law system, vision and sight is a key part of how property operates. So she talks about seeing property. For instance, that she gives the example of colonists, Captain Cook and British colonists first arriving in Hawaii, on the island of Hawaii. And they came with particular ideas of what property would look like to them. So as far as they were concerned, property involved a form of enclosure. So they needed to see some poles or fence or cultivation or something like that. And when they arrived in Hawaii, they saw some of that and they thought, okay, this is a kind of property, maybe. And then back home, what they were familiar with was a kind of feudal system of kings and queens owning property. So they assumed, well, if we see what looks like property back home, therefore this property must be controlled by kings and queens, just like it is back home. Without paying deeper attention to the kinds of signs that people might use there to communicate who holds claims or ownership over property. Similarly, when the Dutch arrived in the Cape and they were confronted with Khoisan people using the land, and they thought, well, this doesn't look like the kind of property we're used to seeing. People have not fenced things in, they're not cultivating in the same way that we thought, they're moving around a lot. We don't think this is property. These people don't have land rights. So the point that Rose makes is that the way in which we see property, when we look at a fence or a map, carries with it a particular kind of historical baggage. It's not something natural, that just because there are lines on a map that indicate ownership, that always means that someone has ownership in the kind of one-to-one individual to land notion of ownership. So I put up some pictures here that are kind of different signs of property, some of which Rose refers to. So the first one is a title deed. It's a deed of sale, actually made to a company called the Native Farmers Association of South Africa. They're a company that I'm studying as part of my PhD research. And one of their founding members was Pixley Kaseme, one of the founders of the ANC. And the Native Farmers Association managed to acquire a piece of land as a company. And this is a deed of sale, a kind of title deed that they received. Number 2 is a map of another area that I'm studying near Barberton in Mpumalanga. And you can see how it's carved out on this map, the names of different farms, as well as the numbers of particular plots of land. Number 3 is a fence from the same area of the country, also from Mpumalanga. And number 4 is a scene from Chicago, where I did my studies for a while. It's a scene that Rose also mentions. And I'd just be interested, if you've never been to Chicago, so maybe the other 3 pictures you might be familiar with from thinking about property here in South Africa, but picture number 4, would that communicate anything to you? What do you think that would mean?
Don't park here.
You saw it. Okay, great. So
this is my spot.
Yeah. So
Thrown away, obviously. Help yourself.
Free chairs. Okay. Cool. So
see who has and who hasn't lived in the US, right? And borne the wrath of moving the chairs and parking in the spot.
Right. So if you've never lived in a place that's really snowy, where people are trying to carve out spaces for parking, you just saw 3 chairs sitting on the side of the road. Maybe it's a place to like sit and read your book for a bit. Maybe it's maybe they're chairs that people have put out for you to take. But if you've lived in a place like Chicago for a long time, what the chairs represent is a claim on that space for parking. So they're saying, do not park here. I've claimed this as my own by putting this chair out. But if you didn't know that, if you weren't accustomed to seeing the chairs as an ownership claim on that piece of space, then it would be very difficult to know what they meant. So there's a kind of history, system of meaning and value behind each of these signifiers, many of which we know so well, like a map or a fence. We've come to take as just kind of natural and normal, that obviously that person's taking a claim on their property. But what I think the Chicago example shows is that that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's a very interesting exercise to interrogate, well, where do these signs come from? How did they come to seem so natural? So for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'd like you to consider a couple of questions. So the first is, as far as you're concerned, what are the kind of signs of property ownership that you've become accustomed to? So maybe again you can turn to the person next to you or back to your small groups and think about what are the signs of ownership of property that you know of. Just kind of list them all and chat about them. And secondly, I'd like you to think about who has had the power to persuade people that these are signs of ownership. So one of the arguments that Rose makes is that if I was just to put, say, I don't know, a pen on this table, that might mean that I'm occupying the space, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I own this table. So if I was to try and persuade you guys that by putting the pen here, I own this table, how would I do that? So it's not a very good example, but as I was saying, these are not natural ways of communicating claims on land or ownership of land. So perhaps brainstorm a bit, how do you think people came to persuade others that when I put a fence around a piece of land, that means it's mine, and you guys are excluded from it, and only the people who I say are allowed to be included in it? So think about the signs and then think about how they came to be. So take a few minutes to talk about that, and then we'll come back and discuss them. Oh yeah. Really? They also put chairs up.
They don't put chairs, but everybody puts their own face.
Yeah.
Everybody is very safe. You don't harm over the other person around.
Right.
And but when in observatory, our senses ultimately they're always because some in a way it wasn't quite sideways and we were because everyone was
That's interesting. Right.
Everybody knows in a particular community. He was challenged on his own understanding of this. And he was like, if I'm consistent, I'm not going to do that. Yes, that's what it says.
Right. It's not strictly ego.
Yeah. It's on ego, then signs.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's socialized understanding that everyone has come to.
And then when the police they're like a little bit lost. I mean, they know that that's how it operates. They know that checking on people are right and decide it's not observing or social contract somewhere. And it's being rude and racist and but actually, we don't quite see that they can't be involved either, right? So they're not able to be on behalf of the people either. It was
Okay, everyone, so finish off your discussions. Let's come back together. So, in a sense, the question that I'm asking is based on one that others have also asked. In looking at these signs of how people communicate their ownership over property, the question is, well, how do things become owned? How do we know that something is owned? So what were some of the things that you discussed in your groups in terms of what are the signs you've seen of property, and how do you think they came to be naturalized, or how do you think people were persuaded that, yes, this is something that is owned, and then, in fact, so persuaded that even the law said, we recognize this as something that is owned? Yeah.
So one thing we spoke about was the concept of prescription.